Well, good morning, Dunbar Heights. Pastor Wes here, welcoming you to Fellowship Sunday. We've been talking about Fellowship Sunday. Maybe you got no idea what that means. And just very briefly, our church is a part of a Canada-wide denomination known as the Fellowship of Evangelical Baptists of Canada. And our Pacific region of that denomination, known as Fellowship Pacific, is the over 100 churches spread throughout British Columbia and Yukon. And all of what Fellowship Sunday is about is celebrating God's work through our churches, what He's done up until now, what we are praying and believing Him to do in the future. And so that's what we're going to do today in a second. We're going to hear some stories about God's work through different churches. We're going to hear a brief update and message from our regional director, Dave Harita. It's all about just celebrating God's work through our churches. Just briefly before we get into that, I wanted to give us a few quick announcements before we head into that. The first one being that next Sunday, which will be the last Sunday of the month, again, we are trying to facilitate some in-person gathering. We're allowed to gather 50 people outside, and so we will be opening up registrations on our website for those people who are interested in and would like to be a part of an in-person gathering. It'll be right out here in the parking lot of the church. We're going to set up tents and have that ready for you. So if you want to pre-register, we're allowed to have up to 50 people. So the first 50 people that register, we will send out emails and let you know what the procedure will be going ahead. We will still have an online service taking place on Sunday, so that will still be happening. You won't miss out on church. We'll be still sending out our Scattered Together gathering. But we will be having that in-person gathering Sunday morning, next Sunday. So if you'd like to be a part of that, please join us here at the church out in the parking lot next Sunday. A second announcement. The following week, June 6th, is our trimesterly members meeting. So by tomorrow, you should have the agenda as well as any kind of supporting documents you need sent out to you ahead of time, so you have that 2-week time period to consider what are the things that we're going to be looking at, be praying for what we'll be voting about in those areas. So if you are a member and you haven't received those documents by Monday, if you could email either me here at the church, Wesley at dhbc.ca, or office at dhbc.ca, we'll make sure that you get those documents right away. Be excited about that. There's so much going on and so much we want to share with you. So that's coming up in 2 weeks' time, June 6th. Very last announcement, as I want to just remind us each week, please continue to be faithful throughout the week in your prayer and your giving. We have tried to make opportunities to continue to do those things, whether through online prayer gatherings, home groups, the prayer chain, as well as in giving, with online giving, people sending in their giving here at the church office, in our mailbox, whatever it is. Please continue to be faithful in those ways, as it both supports the ministries of this church, but also builds and grows your own faith as we demonstrate through our life and through our actions where our security and where our hope is truly found. So let's get now to Fellowship Sunday. Thanks for taking the time to gather with us this way today. Let's dig in together. Fellowship Sunday.
Through COVID, our church has really learned to be more intentional about ministering to the community. Now, I know we've always wanted to be intentional and creative in how we serve our local community here, but at South Delta Baptist Church, through COVID, we recognize that there will be lots of needs with people suffering through loneliness and mental health needs and other challenges through this time of COVID. So we started asking our local government, we started asking our school districts, we started asking our community partners, what are some of the needs and how can we help? And we learned through that we had a local organization that's in the senior housing industry and care facilities, and they were going through a COVID outbreak, and they had over 80 confirmed cases of COVID at the time. And this is residents that's only a few kilometers away from our church. So we reached out to them and asked, how could we help? We want to just be here and support you. And they said, you know what? Our staff is really exhausted through this terrible year that we've been going through. It would be really encouraging if they were treated to like a nice meal or something. So we decided to raise some funds and announce to the church, and the church was all over it. We had some residents that were part of our church family that lived there, so of course we wanted to bless them with everything that we could. So we treated every staff member to a meal, and a fancy meal at that, and we had a local favorite restaurant that we partnered with to deliver amazing food to the whole staff. Not only that, but we filled their staff room with beautiful artwork and flowers and food and beverages to just lift their hearts up a bit and say, we're thinking of you, we're praying for you, and we just want to support you during this time. They also gave us first names of every resident that was going through this COVID in their center, and we were able to write handwritten cards of encouragement to every single resident there. Now, COVID has surfaced some challenges in our communities. So this is an opportunity for us. Even though it's been a terribly challenging year for us, it's an opportunity for us to step in and say, we want to share the love of Christ with you. We want to show you that God cares about you, that God loves you, and he wants to help you in your struggles. So we've been able to reach out to our community in a meaningful way during COVID. And I think this is something that we've learned to do, not just this through the pandemic, but also as we come out of it, we want to continue this movement.
Hello, my name is Claudia. I have been a chaplain for the past 8 months at a senior home in White Rock, British Columbia. And my favorite story of seeing Jesus at work is with Chloe. That's not her real name, but Chloe is almost 100 years old. And part of my role was to outreach to residents here. And so I went to visit with her and I asked her, Chloe, how are you doing? And she said, well, I'm just fine. I am never lonesome. I'm never bored. And during the night, Jesus holds me tight. And I was so delighted with the surprise that here I go to outreach to somebody and it's actually Jesus showing that he's there already. It was almost when I knocked on the door that Jesus opened the door and said, Claudia, may I help you? And the same resident, Chloe, a few months later, when residents were allowed to come down to the shared dining room, I was asking her how she was liking the food, because in previous occasions she was not very happy with the food. And she says, Claudia, it's okay, because, food is not what ultimately fills me. And so I realized that for Chloe, Jesus is truly her everything. And even in times, another time when during the lockdown, more strict lockdown, I noticed that she was having some altered perceptions of how people were treating her or the staff. So I didn't think they were true. But even in those altered perceptions of how people were treating her, Jesus was there. The word of Jesus was there, inviting her to a certain direction of forgiveness, of grace, of trust that he's ultimately in control of everything. So I'm just delighted to see how God is at work caring for those he loves, and he's ahead of us. And it's a delight to notice that our missionary God is inviting us to join him in what he's already doing, even during this pandemic. Thank you.
In recent years, I reviewed my life more than I ever have. That may be something to do with the turmoil of the past year, which has kind of focused it. So civil unrest due to racial injustice or political turmoil that seems to be shaking the roots of democracy, or most obviously the pandemic pandemonium. Or maybe it's just that in my role as regional director for Fellowship Pacific, I'm tired of being asked when the church world is going to return to normal. But the fact is, whether I like it or not, it is the question I have gotten asked the most for over a year, whether through phone calls or in person. In spring 2020, Harvard Business Review published an article which became the most widely read digital article in their illustrious history, where they described our collective feelings of grief and loss during the pandemic as mourning the loss of normalcy. But the truth is, I really don't like the question, when will we return to normal? In fact, the more I hear those words, the more flashbacks that I've had of a period in my life when my musical tastes were directed towards a folk rock fusion that was expressed by Canadian musician Bruce Coburn. I know, I get it. Some of you have never heard of him. You're too young to have ever heard of him, nor do you care. So let me tell you that Bruce Coburn has won 13 Juno Awards. He has 6 honorary doctorates. He has received the Order of Canada, the Queen Elizabeth Medal, among many other awards. He even has his own Canadian postage stamp. And yet, I know, most of you still don't care. Maybe it will matter more when I tell you he was interviewed about his faith in Christianity Today in 2012, and he talked about how he gave his life to Jesus. Again, with most superstars, it's hard to know. Regardless, in 1981, Coburn released a platinum-selling album that included a fascinating song that was entitled "The Trouble with Normal Is It Always Gets Worse." And that song's been kind of wandering through my mind throughout COVID. The more I've been asked when we're going to return to normal, the more I've wondered whether Bruce Coburn was right. And should we, as Christians, as local church aficionados, really want a return to normal? Or is it true to say that the trouble with normal is it always gets worse? So I invite you to think about this with me for a few minutes. Consider some of the stories of the Old Testament. In Judges, for example, if we were to dig into that, the pattern is quite simple. The Israelites would be threatened by a nation that was stronger than them, one that could probably take them over, maybe wipe them out, and God raises up a leader who is called a judge, who leads them to a spectacular and miraculous victory. You know many of those stories really well. And Israel swears to follow God, and they do so for a while until things become normalized, and then they grow complacent. They focus on their own stuff, and to quote the repeated phrase in the book of Judges, they do evil in the sight of God again. Then the cycle recurs. Wash, rinse, repeat, over and over. The actual words describing this are found in Judges 2, 16 to 19. So let me read them for you. Judges 2, 16 to 19. It says, "Then the Lord raised up judges," that is, after opposition had arisen for Israel, "who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. They quickly turned from the ways of their ancestors, who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. Whoever the Lord raised up as a judge saved them. He was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies, as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping them, and they refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways." It goes on to say, "Therefore the Lord was angry with Israel, and God used other nations to try and bring them back to him over and over and over. Wash, rinse, repeat." So as you can hear, normal was not their friend. Their commitment to God was generated by desperation, and it was at its best when they knew they needed God. And not in some general, cultural, Christian kind of way, but with a legitimate, heart-wrenching, buzzing in the soul kind of distress. Let's journey down this road a little bit further, looking at some more biblical history. Let's glance at the beginning of the story of the prophet Daniel. It's 605 BC. The superpowers of Babylon, Egypt, and Syria are in a war to become the preeminent power, and Judah is geographically stuck in the middle of them. Judah has aligned themselves with Egypt, thinking that that would keep them safe. But not long afterwards, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon won a huge, decisive battle over Egypt at a place called Carchemish, and it left the borders of Palestine wide open. Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon drives through that open door and shows up at the gates of Jerusalem, in a story that's told to us in 2 Chronicles. Babylon walks in, they set up a puppet king, and they begin a series of deportations that we hear about in the book of Daniel, which is how Daniel himself ended up in Babylon. It's really difficult for us to understand the heartache expressed in the second verse of the first chapter of Daniel, where it says, "The Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar." Did you catch that? The Lord delivered Judah to Nebuchadnezzar. It was not just the collapse of the country, but the defeat of hope. God's people had turned away from him. They had begun to live their normal, comfortable, and frankly, idolatrous lives. The north, Israel, had already been crushed by Assyria, and they had been carried away and some of them deported. But God was not going to just leave Judah in their status quo conditions, and so Babylon was used by God to achieve change. And these stories and these warnings are abundant in the Old Testament. We could talk about them all day. These all root back to the promises of God for his first call to Abraham in Genesis 12, and to the not yet formed nation of Israel. Abraham was promised that through him all the nations of the earth would be blessed. That was reiterated again in the blessings and curses given to Moses in Deuteronomy 28. You may remember it. If they're obedient, God will bless. If they're disobedient, they're going to be in trouble. Well, however else we may see it, God never calls his people to normal. Because the trouble with normal is it always gets worse. And God has always done what he needs to do to ensure that it doesn't stay that way. So, some of you are thinking, sure, I get that, but that's the Old Testament. That doesn't really apply to the New Testament church. So I'm pleased to be able to answer clearly. It completely applies. It totally applies. There is almost nothing about our call to Christ or the church in the New Testament that would be considered normal. Let's start with this. We preach Christ crucified, the Son of God, born to die in our place for our sin, raised from dead on the third day, ascended to heaven to prepare a place for us, where he might be glorified for eternity. In his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus taught us to be countercultural in most everything we do, to be the salt of the earth, the light of the world, the city on a hill that cannot be hidden. He told us to count the cost, that whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but those who lose their life for his sake will find it. He taught us that everything could be summed up in loving the Lord our God with all our heart and all our soul and all our mind and all our strength, and loving our neighbors as ourselves. He gave a living demonstration of what that love looked like by washing the feet of his disciples that he knew was going to betray him, and then telling us to go and love in the same way. There's not much room for normal in any of that. There is not much leeway for being comfortable in that. We could also review some of the teaching of the Apostle Paul. There would be a lot on this particular topic. For example, he told us in Romans 12 to not conform to the pattern of this world, that is, world normalcy, but to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. He reiterates this in Corinthians 15, where the central message, he said, had to be the gospel that he preached, which they received, upon which they had taken their stand. Nothing else could replace it. We can look at the book of Acts and see how God used worldwide persecution to scatter the church in order to spread the gospel. We could burrow into John's letter to the churches, sharing the revelation he received, reminding us over and over that hard things happen as the church fulfills its Christ-given mission in the world. So we need to keep our eyes on the throne room of heaven rather than the events of earth. I could pursue this topic a long time. My bottom line point is simply this. Why do we hear so many Christian people asking for a return to normal post-pandemic? Normal has rarely been the friend of the church. And the trouble with normal is it always gets worse. As is likely true for many of you, I've spent a lot of time asking what God is saying to us through the duration of COVID. Because if there's one thing I feel certain about, it's that God is, in fact, speaking. Whether it was in the time of Judges or Daniel or the diaspora of the early church, none of this happens outside of his control. So still today, we do not have worldwide events encircling our planet that affects everybody on the planet without God speaking. The real question is whether or not we're listening. So while I make no pretense or claim of being a prophet, I do have the privilege of interacting with a broad swath of churches within Fellowship Pacific, as well as with other denominational groups. So let me suggest that the pandemic, as it begins to wane, requires us to do a lot more than return to normal. The pandemic is not a standalone event. Within North America, it has coincided with great civil unrest, with revealed bigotry and racism, with gigantic cracks in the fabric and assumptions of truth, with demonstrable crumbling of the principles of democracy and limits to what we would consider freedom. And throughout all of this, the conservative church has not come through unscathed, nor should it, because God has been speaking. At the risk of overgeneralizing or creating a caricature of truth, let me suggest some things that have been revealed in the last year about far too large a segment of comfortable, normal North American Christianity. Normal has become protecting our rights at the cost of our gospel mission. Normal has been sacrificing a demand for truth at the altar of expediency and then arguing why that's the right thing to do. Normal has been equating our love for and obedience to Jesus with our political affiliation and then judging others on the basis of that. Normal has been justifying or tacitly accepting our systemic racism if it protects our sense of religious privilege. Normal has been defining discipleship as maintaining and running programs rather than a spirit-led relationship with Jesus. Normal has been minimizing wholehearted worship to nothing more than a Sunday service. Normal has relegated evangelism to reciting memorized lines or reposting online sermons rather than loving, engaging, and sharing Jesus with our neighbors. It's become believing that it's the role of a secular government to reinforce why church is essential, rather than asking ourselves why our lives, our words do not demonstrate or shout the gospel sufficiently, regardless of the government. Now, perhaps some of you think that's harsh and it's unfair to say to you. And you're probably right. I think I agree with you. You see, I'm not really talking to you. I started this talking to myself in the past year, trying to listen to what God is saying to me and about himself. I'm desperately trying to step out of my own culturally contented cloak long enough to realize that, at least to some degree, I have a mix of all of those issues, all of those things I just mentioned in my own life. I want to suggest to you that normal in our local North American churches is a substantial distance from what Jesus called us to, and perhaps it has been for a long, long time. And I simply, this morning, want to invite you into that conversation between you and God, because maybe God has something to say to you, just as he has something to say to me. So look, I know that when I throw around the term normal, in that way you hear it like a swear word, and some of you are smart enough to realize that it's really kind of unfair. And in some senses it is, because we have many great churches. We have awesome Christ-following leaders that I value and appreciate. And we do want and need to obediently regather as the church post-COVID. And it will be exciting when we do it. We know that corporate worship, including singing, sermons, and the community gathering, are critical parts of belonging to the body of Christ. We are aware that we do need programs and groups and ministries targeted to various groups. And I too want all those things and more, just the same as most of you. But let's never forget that God has, throughout history, insisted that the church stay on track and focus on the right things. That we refuse the idolatry of our pride, the intoxication of power, the soul poverty of our wealth, and the comfort of our perceived safety in programs, and that we give our allegiance to him alone as Lord, and then we live it out. God is calling us to something greater than normal. He is calling us to something extraordinary for his glory and kingdom. COVID has been very hard and tragic for many people. We all pray, at least I hope we are, that we are in its final stretch of sickness and restrictions. And if you're one of those who has paid a heavy price, please know that as Fellowship Pacific, we love you, we stand with you, we pray with you. But we do need to understand that God does not allow these things lightly. There is a purpose. And God did, in fact, allow this. God is yearning for us to listen carefully and to come back from the pandemic different than we went in, to be thoughtful, with aching hearts that we would be the church that he gave his son to create. remembering over and over that the trouble with normal is it always gets worse. As we return to the church post-COVID, let's ask for, demand for something a whole lot more. There's a second song by Bruce Coburn that's been echoing through the somewhat empty chambers of my mind throughout the year of COVID. And it's titled Waiting for a Miracle. Some of you, maybe, probably not, have heard it. The refrain of it goes like this. He says, you rub your palm on the grimy pain in the hope that you can see. You stand up proud. You pretend you're strong in the hope that you can be like the ones who've cried, like the ones who've died, while they're waiting for a miracle. I'm praying for a miracle. First and foremost, that I would hear clearly what God has been saying, and that I would have the courage to change. And second miracle is that maybe it wouldn't just be me that thinks we need that miracle. Please join me in a future that is far more than normal. Thanks for spending this time together.
Well, this is what it's looked like for pretty much all of us this past year, hasn't it? Empty church buildings, preaching to a camera in the midst of empty pews, ministering to people on a computer screen through a Zoom call. This pandemic has been challenging, of course, globally, but the church has been by no means exempt from any of that challenge. It's been hard on us, too. One of the things here at Dunbar Heights, which we missed this past year in particular, was being able to invite our surrounding community into this space for our annual Christmas at Dunbar celebration. This is an outreach where we invite people in to celebrate the hope and the joy of Christmas through food and music and fun. And of course, this year we weren't welcoming anybody into our space. Nobody was. And so the challenge then as a leadership became, well, how can we as a church continue to share the hope of Christmas when we can't bring people in here to share it with them? And so one of the ideas that we had was, well, what if we took all the celebration and decoration and light that we normally put in this sanctuary space and moved it on the outside of the church building, so that as people walk to their homes and surrounding schools each day, they would see that hope and light on the front of our church building, on the outside. And so that's what we tried. The team put together a beautiful display out front, all these whole front of the church, different colored lights. We had one of those cool switchers that makes all these different flashing patterns. We had stuff projected up on the roof. Going to all that effort, not knowing if this would have any impact at all, and yet, surprisingly, and actually maybe not surprisingly at all, knowing how our God works, what we began to see in the coming weeks was people stopping us out on the streets, calling and emailing into the church saying, thank you, love what you've done with the church. I remember one person in particular emailing in and saying, in the past 30 years of living in this community, I've never seen the church building look so beautiful. Going on to add, thank you for helping to bring a little bit of light in this really dark time in our world right now. And I remember thinking, like isn't that the message of Christmas? That God, in sending Jesus, was shining his light into the darkness. And it helped me just to see, man, God, you're working. You're continuing to use your church to build your kingdom, despite our weakness, despite the fact that we can't do all the stuff that we want to do. And it reminded me of something which I've preached multiple times from this pulpit, and yet I still fail to live out many times. And the reason is, I don't know if that's the same with you, but I like to lead out of a place of strength, out of a place of stability, where I've got everything put together and I can offer this well-presented package to people. And not being able to do that, it reminded me of Jesus on a mountainside feeding 5,000 men and their families. And as he invited his disciples to join him in ministering to those people, you remember, he didn't ask them, hey guys, have you got enough food to feed everybody? Have you got enough skill or ability or power to minister to every single one of these people? No, he just asked them one simple question. He just said, what do you have? What do you have? And then he took what they had, which was not nearly enough, and he multiplied it in order to minister to every single one of those people. And so what we learned again this year, and what I want to share and encourage you with today, is just that. Just offer God what you have. Just offer him what you have, which won't be enough. It won't be. But trusting that by faith, God can take what we offer him and He can still use it to multiply it and serve and minister to every single one of the people that we're wanting to reach.